Welcome everyone to my introduction into Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason. So I will take the word introduction quite literally as a leading you into the text, and I'm trying to do so in a way that will open up the text for you in its true scope and genuine significance. Because there are incredible misconceptions when it comes to Kant, and especially the first critique. The two misconceptions are that Kant writes an epistemology, that's the first one, and that the first critique is a synthesis of, or the entire critical project of Kant is a synthesis of empiricism and rationalism. I will say a bit more on this in a second. And the way in which I will present the introduction here to you is by heart, not by rote. I will go over my notes. I have only a few things written down, so I won't be reading anything. I will speak from memory and will be conducting this as such in modo adagio. So I will be moving slowly. There will be presumably no edits to this, so I won't cut anything out if there's a longer break where I need to pause and think a bit longer on how to articulate what I'm about to say. Now, let me point out the following. If Kant had written something as benign as an epistemology, something as harmless as an epistemology, he would hardly have become the most significant philosopher since Aristotle. Kant's critique of pure reason depicts a revolution in the form of thought, and explicitly so. If you read Kant himself, this is what he aimed to do. He aimed at revolutionizing thought itself, the form of thought. So, the first critique presents us with logic, with a logic, not just any logic, but with transcendental logic, which is a high moment in logic itself. Now, I should correct myself here a little bit, perhaps. When I say a logic, that's basically just a crutch for me in articulating this. We cannot differentiate different logics, as it were. Logic, just as thinking, is one, but there are different moments of it, let's say. And how transcendental logic and transcendental idealism hence differs is what we will be discussing as I'm leading you further into the book. So let me go back a few steps to the beginning of this when I said that the two misconceptions are that Kant writes an epistemology and that he synthesizes rationalism and empiricism in doing so. Now, sometimes you can even hear people claim that Kant in the first critique presents us with an ontology. That is not the case. Kant totally destroys ontology. So we won't even consider that at all. Now, an epistemology, simply put, in a standard sense, is how we form knowledge of an object and how we know that knowledge, how we know that knowledge to be true, or say how a true representation, how we can form a true representation of some object, be it of everyday experience or scientific experience. A scientific object could also be an object, of course, of the mind. Just think of particles, etc. Now, this is not Kant's question. Now, what are rationalism and empiricism? Again, simply put, rationalism is a doctrine of the soul, where the soul, being conceived as rational, contains inherently by birth certain categories or concepts by which the soul, or the rational mind, to put it in more modern terms, accesses the world. Now, this again is not what Kant is after. There's nothing inherent. Kant does not present us with a bag of the soul and describes its faculties, etc. What has to be pointed out, though, is that Kant uses the language of the philosophers at his time, who are, however, lower in terms of their reflection, in terms of their grasp. Empiricism, on the other hand, would presume that categories we're not born with the categories, but instead that we form categories, that would be Locke, by experience, or that there aren't any, to be fair, if we go to a full-on skeptical empiricism. And the usual idea out there is that Kant synthesizes the two, so that he leaves some aspects of rationalistic doctrine of the soul, because he speaks of the categories, obviously, and also that he combines this and gives justification to and gives a proper place to experience. But Kant does something else. Kant is after the form of thought itself, and this is what we will now address further. Now, the reason why this is, of course, crucial is that even just narrowly within philosophy, if you want to understand so-called post-Kantian philosophy, especially the period that's come to be called German idealism, so beginning after Fichte with Schelling and Hegel and Hölderlin to a certain degree, you will not be able to grasp why Hegel writes the science of logic if you don't understand, even just in a rudimentary sense, that Kant presents us with a revolution of thought in terms of logic. Because with Kant, logic is no longer just an organon, no longer just a tool. Instead, logic now becomes the way in which experience and objectivity are formed. And he does so in transcendental logic in such a way that he can avoid dialectics. So Kant is after keeping up, maintaining the principle of non-contradiction and taming the dialectics of reason. The ramifications of this, by the way, will also still hold for Heidegger, who never really grasps the significance of Hegel's science of logic and the dialectics of reason, who also refers to dialectics as the embarrassment of philosophy. And hence, understanding Kant properly is crucial, however, beyond just the narrow scope of philosophy, perhaps. If we want to understand our time, our age, as an age of a knowledge of domination over nature. So if you think about how we access the world, how we have any relationship with the world, is for the most part scientific, even scientistic, and rationalistic in this contemporary sense of what rationality is supposed to mean as calculation, calculative access to things, to quote-unquote reality, which in a philosophical sense means just framework, in which there's always already, that's to say before experience, before anything could show itself by itself, which is, by the way, that's the impulse of phenomenology, right, of Husserl and Heidegger, is to go back to the things themselves, to let them show themselves, That's not what Kant is after at all, and this is not what the sciences are after either. The sciences want to present reality, that's to say, a framework in which always already the preconceived hypotheses are basically proven correspondingly by that which is then showing up, that is already framed by that which is shown up thanks to the a priori necessary conditions. So the word transcendental in Kant does not mean to transcend all experience. It doesn't have to do with transcendence at all in a sense, but it means to go before experience. Transcendental means, simply put, necessary a priori conditions for experience, enabling experience. And what experience is, we'll get to in a second, or maybe I should point it out now. Experience for Kant is, as you can read in the first critique, is the product of the understanding. So experience itself is logical, a product of the understanding, and is hence a process. It's not something that we experience in our everyday life world. It's also important to understand that what Kant is addressing, even in the second critique, which is on ethics, if you like, to put it simply, on practical reason, the critique of practical reason, Kant does not address us as persons, but as beings of the understanding, as Verstandeswesen. So I think I've covered in some rudimentary way how to understand Kant, how not to understand Kant, and rather to understand from the beginning, see from the beginning that what he's doing, he's revolutionizing the form of thought, which is prior to all experience, prior to all concerns of epistemology, and he does this on the level, on the plane of logic, not on the plane of psychology in the old sense, in the metaphysical sense of the word. So it's not a rationalistic doctrine of the soul. It's not a question of whether we're born with ideas or concepts, but it is solved and addressed and solved on the level of a logic, a principle of necessary positings. So what is the first critique? Is a system of the positings of the I. So let me read Kant himself. Kant, with his transcendental philosophy, he says, is the idea of a science for which the critique of pure reason is to outline the entire plan architectonically, that's to say from principles, with a full guarantee for the completeness and certainty of all the components that comprise this edifice, before any empirical experience. That's at B27. So, let me now take a look at my notes here. Let me just double check. Yeah. Perhaps also briefly, something I've forgotten to mention. You probably have heard that this notorious notion that Kant uttered that when he said that David Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers. Now, this is often taken as an indication that Kant appreciates the empirical and the sensual. No, he does, but only in a sense that is not to do with any sense data or genuine experience, but insofar that the logical form of thought must in principle a priori already be bound in potentia, if you like, to the possibility of experience, but not to any experience itself. So we cannot really describe with Kant experience. Instead, what he's after, or basically what he's providing us with, is a justification for the fact that, he shows us how and why it is possible that given the same conditions in a laboratory, for example, an experiment will always yield the same result. The price that we pay is high with Kant. It's a high price. Because what happens is that what things are in themselves, their essence, is pushed into the noumenal, into a liminal where we don't know what the essence is of something. If I have here a stone from Scotland, now alabaster, if I drop that stone, then to an Aristotelian, what becomes visible is something unique, namely the unique essence, ousia, presence of this particular stone. That's what metaphysica, that's what metaphysics aims to get to. Now, Aristotelian metaphysics, that is. Now, with for a Newtonian, or modern day physicist, what we see is only the law of gravity. And this is quite similar for Kant. So this was just an example, as an illustration, as it were. Now, for natural scientists, really what is at the forefront is control over nature. That is what their concern is. That's their aim. That's the aim of the natural sciences. Galileo, by the way, does not present us with reality, yes, if we understand reality in the proper sense, which is a model framework, but not with actuality. And he instead constructs an idealized world. And Kant, as it were, writes the philosophy for this. Formal logic has the character of what ought to be. And Transcendental logic is now a first attempt to bind logical form again to content. But as I said before, in the a priori, so not to actual content, but only so that the content is, as it were, generated, we could almost say, by the a priori conditions. So formal logic respects the principle of non-contradiction, and this is why time is so important, by the way, in Kant, because time, strictly linear time, a linear sequence, allows to construct an object that changes over time without running into a contradiction. And so perhaps we can already see here that what the first critique does is to move into the form of thought and look at the necessary conditions so that objects can be constructed without contradiction. So this is das Ansinnen in German. So the project, let's say, and is to be able to construct objects without any resistance. You can think this further in terms of capitalistic reproduction, etc. And as you know, there are people out there who would lay it on the feet of Kant that how capital reproduces itself. That this is genuinely something that Kant enables with his thought. So if you'd like to understand accelerationism, you need to grasp Kant on the level really of transcendental logic rather than any sort of epistemology. And Kant sees something significant though. which is that in rationalism, let's say Leibniz or Wolff, that's always the two that he addresses, maybe more so Wolff than Leibniz, that reason can construct models that are inherently significant, meaningful, and without contradiction. They hold up within themselves. In formal terms, they make perfect sense. But not only can there be multiple models that compete with each other, also they are not bound to experience. And once you bind them to experience, they collapse. To speak a bit facetiously, in terms of Leibniz's monadology, wonderful text, holds up, but show me a monad. You see, Kant does not deny such endeavors, but what he denies is that they show us, they don't lead us actually to reality, but instead, but if they do lead us to but what Kant then leads us to, if he leads us to reality, is that it's a framework. So he does not lead us with Kant. We don't get to actuality, which is also why one really cannot stop with Kant. I hope that I'm getting across what I'm trying to say, which is that with Kant, we really begin to have here a move beyond just rationalistic model construction, but at the same time, the price that we come to pay is high, which is the abandonment of the ousia, the unique presence or essence of particular things. So let me now continue. For Kant, the logical form is, there's only one really, which is transcendental apperception. Logical principles are always already demands, which are relative upon something, or relative to something, and they serve purely and solely to keep up, to maintain the identity of self-consciousness. But self-reflection, etc., is not an issue for Kant. Now, again, logical principles are demands that are relative to something. Relative to something that, let's say, could be there in potentia. So it's not describing how experience works, etc., but instead it's describing a priori the potential process of experience guided by the logical form of transcendental apperception, which is the a priori, before experience, enabling condition of apperceptere, of perceiving and combining, unifying the manifold of what appears. But so, and what then is formed, and we're speaking really here scientifically, what is formed through transcendental perception, the categories, etc., and the judgment, is an object. Is an object in its objectivity. So those are not, in a sense, given. The objects aren't given, and I have representation of the object, and then I make sure that what I know about the object is true or not true, and how far it corresponds to it. That's not the question. Instead, the object is indeed formed by this process that Kant calls experience, which is, to quote from Kant directly, experience is without doubt the first product which our understanding brings forth. This is the first sentence of the first introduction of the first critique. Many firsts here. Now with Hume, something crucial happens. I should have probably mentioned this earlier, forgive me. Hume leads to the collapse of the unity of thinking and being. So Hume is highly modern philosopher and also a proto-nihilist. The collapse of thought and being, of the unity of thought and being, signifies the collapse, if you'd like to have a more poetic, perhaps, approach to this, signifies the, not just radical doubt in scientific findings, etc., no, but really profound falling out of the world, falling out of man's place in the world is lost. Hume, as you probably know, argued that it's just habit, that A causes B, and that we subjectively add the principle of causality, that it is a subjective fiction. By the way, Nietzsche is actually very close to that as well. However, one question that of course he doesn't address is, with what right is this being presupposed? So, as you may know, and I'm paraphrasing here, Hume points out that he doesn't know or cannot know for certain whether the sun will rise tomorrow. So we can see here with this example that he gives that there is really an estrangement from the world that is also occurring here. It's not just about causality in the sciences. It is about our place in the world and in the cosmos, etc. So Kant asks, with what justification or with what right, and this is also the question of the deduction, do we combine A and B to a cognition, let's say? But don't conflate this with a standard epistemology. This Kant's question, as you can hear, comes earlier. So, and Kant also wants to address something else, which is that this doesn't just happen internal in one mind, or even if it's an intersubjective mind, etc. But instead, it must be ultimate. So it must have ultimate validity over the object in question. And what formal logic cannot do is to give a response on this kind of justification. That it cannot give us a justification, really. And instead, or legitimacy, let's say. It can't give us legitimacy. But instead, only transcendental logic can provide us with justification and legitimacy on how A and B are connected a priori, so that in a later step cognition and knowledge can be formed. This is the crucial move in Kant. So you can see that he's moving behind the traditional approach, and also, of course, addressing here the traditional distinction between the invisible world or the intelligible world and the sensible world. So to continue, in terms of the transcendental deduction, the justification, I will say more on this in a second. It's important to note that the objects of intuition in German is Anschauung, the translation as intuition, I think, comes from the Latin intuitus, so don't conflate this with how we usually understand intuition as intuitive, etc. But instead intuition, so Anschauung, to looking at, gazing at something, seeing something. But again, purely in a logical sense. This is not about our sense perception, but about the potential, the condition for, let's say. So the objects of intuition are logical. And in and you see what I'm trying to say is that this, of course, translates into then a perception of the world that is such that it is always already framed in a certain way, scientifically enframed, really. So there is here a connection, one that Heidegger himself, for some reason, I don't think really saw, but there's a profound connection between Kant's first critique and what Heidegger came to call Gestell. I've written about this in my book on Heidegger, if you're interested in reading up on this. So the objects of intuition are logical, and in this way, also the context or the relationship of form and object stand revealed, logical. So maybe to come back from the dogmatic slumber, it would be a dogmatic, come back to dogmatic slumber, this notion. Dogmatic slumber would be to assume that understanding is an appropriation of something that is already given. However, in a sense, nothing is already given. It is formed. Maybe the manifold of appearances is given, but in a sense, even that is a frame already. So nothing is given. It is from the enactment of thinking and understanding that logical objects are formed in their objectivity. So at B78 in the first critique, Kant hence speaks of Verstandeshandlungen, of acts of the understanding. This is relating to operationes mentis, to use this traditional term, the operations of the mind, thinking as acting, not as a something, as you know, in a more Cartesian sense. The self is understood as a thing. But so thinking is here acting. And Cartesian logic already shows us this. So even though it's described as the self is described, or the ego is described as a res, a thing, that is a res cogitans. That's the crucial part. Cogitans. It's a thinking thing. It's a so Kant here relates to this, but there's no longer a substantive I in Kant. Now, what is crucial to understand is that Kant wants to avoid reification of the I as much as of what is let's say addressed by the I or taken in by transcendental apperception. So we're not talking about different states of the soul or the categories as something that is being applied to something that is already given, and then that changes in a certain way, a certain perspective of something that's already given. No, it's got nothing to do with this. It's a Vollzug, it's an enactment of thinking, and it is really an enactment of thinking that enacts itself. So you should not think of this as a personal, psychological way of thinking, but as genuinely principle logical thinking that thinks and enacts itself. We could perhaps also point out with Descartes, because we already were with Descartes here, that the cogito ergo sum is a synthesis a priori, which is also what, as you know, Kant is after. Here cogitatio and being are synthesized, they're brought together, and they are so because the cogito does not contain necessarily being. That unity of being and thought is there, but the unity of being and thought always has to be articulated. This is not an analytic statement. Right? The bachelor is unmarried is a tautology. It doesn't need to be said. That's analytic. I can make an analytic judgment about a bachelor. I don't need to know more to make a statement about the bachelor's marital status. But if I speak of the cogito, and I want to say that the cogito is also being, then this is already a synthetic a priori judgment. And this is what Kant is after. He's trying to prove that synthetic a priori judgments are possible. Because this saves, and this is crucial, this saves, and this is also what Descartes is after. This is very crucial to understand Descartes also. Descartes is after, is horrified of the prospects of a purely scientific, materialistic universe, mechanistic universe. So he preserves human freedom in the cogito ergo sum. This is crucial also for Kant, that even though he does not follow Descartes by the letter, that in principle Kant is exactly after a transcendental understanding of freedom, one that is not about perception but a synthetic a priori judgment. Now, transcendental logic hence is connected to experience, and that is always a process. So let me now come back to transcendental logic and formal logic. Formal logic cannot address content. There's no general criterion for truth, but the formal logic is only a tool for judgment. And dialectic is always bursts on the scene, or we always do dialectics, if you want to put it like this, when the organon, which is logic, formal logic, and content are being brought together. So we need to perform dialectic when we bring logic as a formal logic, which doesn't address content, but only stays within its own boundaries, is brought together with content. And transcendental logic bridges this gap, as it were, and can address, through the forms of time and space, content in such a way that the principle of non-contradiction can be upheld and dialectics can be avoided. Dialectics would have to allow for, at least to a certain degree, a suspension with the principle of non-contradiction. Not a total breaking with it, but a suspension with it, and a relationship between being and non-being that of course still wants to arrive at proper being, or else we would just be saying nonsense, right? I cannot say this is a table and it's not a table. That's not meaningful. But I can say, in terms of Hegelian dialectics, to put it simply, this is a table and it is a table insofar as it is not anything else. This is so so I think that we've now already seen how an approach in terms of logic is stronger than looking at this as a combination of empiricism and rationalism, or as just an epistemology. We're not looking at how we form knowledge. We're looking at that very forming itself that comes before any such question. Hence, again, experience is without doubt the first product which our understanding brings forth. Experience is not an empirical fact, so it's not something that happens in our life world, but is produced by thinking. And is produced by thinking. So it's an ongoing enactment. It's not you cannot reify it. You see, Hume reifies the self and reifies experience when he says that the self is but a heap of impressions. That is a reification of the self. So, with Kant, experience is logical form, which, in principle, goes towards the manifold. But again, as mentioned before, what things are in themselves, which is what metaphysics addresses, with Kant disappears. Now we could perhaps briefly mention, I should mention that the imagination, the power of the imagination, Allbindungskraft, plays an important role. There is, in principle, eine Bildstruktur, an image structure of objectivity. So the power of the imagination is crucial here. But again, it's not imagining something in concreto, something that's, or in actu, that's concretely there, but is as qua power a necessary moment, as it were, to account for the pictorial structure of objectivity, which, by the way, is exactly how the natural sciences, let's say physics, for example, operates. Models are imaginal, pictorial, and they are then conflated with reality as actuality. Yeah, so this framework becomes the way by which we access that which shows itself, but that is all a priori. It's all before experience. So again, to summarize, Kant presents us with a system of pure principle positings or suppositions, and we're not considering the faculties of that are necessary to form cognition. But instead, it's a strictly principle theory of knowledge, and it is indeed a knowledge of domination, Herrschaftswissen, a knowledge of power, a knowledge of domination over nature. This system that Kant presents us with wants to give a response to the basic question, the fundamental question rather, what does the subjective form of, or the subjective forms of thinking have to do with objectivity? So again, with Hume, being and thought, thinking and being fall apart, but Kant wants to bind them together again in such a way that formal logic has now legitimacy over experience. Again, experience is produced by the understanding. Kant is hence not a metaphysician. When, or if formal logic rather, is supposed to have dignity in terms of cognition, in terms of forming cognition, then it must be applicable to content. And that's the question. You see, that is the question. It's not how do we form knowledge, but how is it that through formal logic, through, let's say, the upholding the principle of non-contradiction, content can be broached in such a way that objects can continuously be formed without contradiction, without inherent resistance. So, there's here a character of necessity, a Notwendigkeitscharakter, that's supposed to be grounded again, because, to say it again, with Hume, thinking and being fall apart. And that really is, if you like, that's the tragic moment of modernity. And all the hurrah about progress and scientific revolutions and all the things that we can do, supposedly or apparently, and all the control that we have, apparently and supposedly, is, well, is the sorry attempt at combining again, at unifying again thinking and being. But it will not work ultimately, because what the sciences deal with are still just models, and hence with so-called reality, with frameworks. Heidegger sees this, almost you could say intuitively or instinctively, in when he speaks of the essence of technology as Gestell, as in framing. When we try to avoid the principle of the contradiction and move towards totality, then, however, we run into a contradiction. Yeah, so Kant himself runs into the antinomies of reason. He tries to avoid contradiction and runs into the antinomies of reason in the Transcendental dialectic, which to him is a mere semblance or mere seeming, is an illusion, but he doesn't allow for it. Logic and metaphysics, hence, they fall apart. So what Kant wants to do is not to write an epistemology, but to write a system, let's say, that secures knowledge, that secures the formation of knowledge, rather, that secures the formation of cognition. So again, what do subjective forms of thinking have to do with objectivity? And this is then also the question really of the transcendental deduction, which means not to deduce from a highest principle, but to justify the a priori application of the concept of the understanding and the accompanying I think to content that is indeed experiential, and however always in such a way that it is not nothing shows itself by itself. Yeah, that's so we are here addressed, as I mentioned before, as beings of the understanding, and as not as persons. The notion or the concept of experience here employed is that of scientific understanding, which again allows for repeating experiments, and which, at least in principle, should lead to the same result. And we can see that this works, even though there is now a replication crisis in the sciences, but we can see that it works for the most part, insofar as we can control, for example, motor engines of different kinds, of spaceships and of airplanes and of cars and buses, with high precision. And engines do not exist in nature, but what we can predict a priori before any experience is that the kerosene or the diesel or the gasoline will always react in the same way, given certain conditions, temperature, for example, altitude, etc. So maybe briefly on the concept of transcendental truth. Transcendental truth, as Kant says, it's what truth is given. It means correspondence between representation and object. But there's something deeper here too, which is that something falls under the condition of the possibility of experience in the first place. So you see how through an a priori in framing, reality is here, then here comes about. So that is transcendental truth for Kant. So while it does go towards experience, that experience is not to show anything of the thing itself, but is to justify and to rectify, to legitimize the framework by which the object has been approached in the first place. Maybe that's one way of putting it, yeah. So when Kant speaks of sensuality or visibility, etc., he's not talking about concrete visible things like this watch or this particular book, etc., but instead he means visibleness, the visibleness of what is visible in principle. Yeah, so he's looking again, one principle positing after another, so that experience becomes possible, enabling a coherent reality. But again, a coherent reality under a knowledge of domination, of power, so that we can precisely not see what things are in themselves. And again, this is where Husserl and Heidegger move in and say, but we need to return to the things themselves. So perhaps in closing, the logical form is transcendental apperception. The I is the logical per se. Hence, yeah. It's not to do with self-reflection. Again, it's not a psychological I. It's not a personal I. It's the logical I. And we're not yet in Fichte, so we cannot speak of the I that posits itself and the not I, etc. But it is the logical I, the I that is the logical, above all, per se, with Kant. And so the transcendental deduction really needs to show that something can, again, in principle, fall under intuition. That everything that falls under it also falls under the concepts of the understanding. Anything else cannot even in principle be experienced. That is crucial. So hence you will find this notion of the always already. That's a timeless past. It's very crucial. Always already means always already before any experience. This is what Kant is after. So if you're reading the text, you'll see that there's one supposition of positing Setzung, I'll say positing, after another, that sets up, this whole apparatus up in such a way that thought, qua transcendental perception, and being, qua objectivity co-formed by subjectivity out of the manifold, are unified, bound together again, in principle, a priori. Kant does not describe actual experience. He doesn't describe what it's like to be a human being with feelings or anything in a life world. None of this. So in this way, the judgment that is formed by transcendental logic, now really in closing, the judgment that is formed by transcendental logic can now really claim objectivity. It couldn't without those suppositions in place. And it couldn't without having bound together, a priori, in principle, the necessary conditions of experience to experienceability. So, and this is crucial because what Kant wants to get to is, because he thinks that the movement of thought, that's his assumption, is judgment, and that in judgment objectivity is formed. And objectivity means, let's say, certainty, certain knowledge over. But all the steps beforehand, those are the crucial ones. And those are the ones that we can say, this is why what revolutionizes the form of thought rather than just an epistemology being written which asks the question, how is it that we know what we know? And also what's important is, of course, that these kinds of judgment are not subjective, but genuinely objective. So that what is now being formed by these judgment is a genuine, is genuinely objective, scientific, can be scientifically proven, can be proven again. And so this objectivity is not a subjective objectivity. It's not an objectivity that is just formed by random subjective whims or anything. It's a genuine objectivity because the subjectivity itself is really taken or anticipated. I don't know if that's the right word. Is really, the subjectivity is itself objectively anticipated or predetermined, as it were, perhaps is a good word. Vorausgegriffen, vorgegriffen, pre-grasped, sounds weird, by objectivity. So I hope that this sheds some light on what the genuine project is of Kant's first critique. Thank you very much.